And by the way, Colonite and Sarah and Lauren and Kathleen, I want to make this a regular part of our conference. So as you're taking your seats, there are a couple of key things, and then I'm going to introduce this wonderful lady next to me. But the first thing is as we finish, I do say a grateful thanks, Claire, to Team Gleason for leading the effort around the Gleason Act and for letting us join you. Now, secondly, around the children. I have been in the nonprofit world for nearly 40 years now. My own son, who is now going to be 32, started as an advocate in the Alzheimer's world when he was 8 years old. I believe that many times our legislators hear the story very differently when it comes from a young son, a young daughter, a grandchild. I think it just, they hear the story very differently. And to a testament to that is Nadia, who's with us. Where are you, Nadia? Right there. She went to her little town's mayor in Alabama, just north of Mobile. I say the name, but I can't say it. It's just not coming to me. Satsuma? And through her efforts with the mayor, was able to get him in her town, her efforts, a proclamation for ALS Awareness Month. So we have examples like that all over. There's not a day that goes by that I don't get an email from a young person who says, can you help me? I have to write a report. I have to understand this or that. And as much as my schedule will allow, I do try to get them on the phone and help them through getting the information they need, because they're our future. They are our future. So, on that note, follow that, Lucy. Follow those kiddos. It is my pleasure to introduce to you someone who I've grown not only to respect, but to truly love and adore over the 3 years I've been with the ALS Association. This is one phenomenal woman who has really given her life to the study of drug therapies and seeking a cure for ALS. I give you none other than our chief scientist, Lucy Bruin.
So we've certainly had a very powerful morning and a tough act to follow, but it's my pleasure really to invite my colleagues from the government partners to the stage, and hope within an hour we're going to truncate a little bit, so we have to be very focused to really give to you the overview of our government partners. I know that there will be many questions. We will try to fit as much as we can in the hour that we have, because we have a hard stop at 10:30, but know that we have a research expo and all my colleagues will be present there, so there are opportunities to talk further. So I really look forward to seeing you later at the expo as well. So I just wanted to qualify and correct the comments here on the title of my slide. Actually, we're looking for treatments, because we know it's going to take multiple treatments to get further to the cure. And so we all know the remarkable time, and nobody will forget. Wherever I travel the world, everyone talks about, they say, ALS, oh yes, the Ice Bucket Challenge. And a lot has happened since. It's been such a tremendous thing, and really recognition to those who were spearheaded that, an amazing change in the field. What's also very amazing, and of course I'm not going to focus on it in this session, we have the privilege of having Dr. Janet Woodcock to speak to us later, but of course for everyone, right at the top of all our successes is the FDA approval of Radicava. That actually comes on the heels of a phenomenal, talking about children and seeing all those wonderful children on stage, a childhood motor neuron disease, SMA, received the first treatment for their disease in December of last year. And what you might not know is that that was on the heels, it was because of an ALS-associated commitment and research that then built partners to that with the NINDS, with Ionis, and now with Biogen, and that same technology is going to be at least applied to 1 in 10 people with ALS, and that is slated for clinical trials at the end of the year. So it's amazing what we can do in our own community, what we can do as a partnership with all these great partners, and how that can impact beyond our disease. And so because of that, we have a very comprehensive program at the ALS Association, our Treat ALS program, which really brings things from early stages all the way through. We might sit here and say, well, now we've got Radicava, well, we must be almost finished, right? Actually, no, we've got a lot more to do, and we have to continue to fill that pipeline. I see it as opportunities, many, many, many coming from the basic research, and only a few trickling to the end. And the more of them we put in line, the more successes we have at the end, and the more we do this in partnership, the easier that journey is. And so we have a fantastic opportunity as an organization and with our partners to really build that bridge between academia and industry and our government partners. Drug discovery is a very systematic approach. It goes through a process. However fast or slow that goes depends on how many opportunities we put in place. But we can really help glue those two very different disciplines, the cleverness and the innovation of the academic scientist who sees many opportunities, and the drug developer who really seizes that one important one to move it forward. And so we're thrilled that this is just a small subset. These are direct partners to us, either receiving funding or providing services in kind. These are just a small smattering of the few things that are really moving along with distinct partners to form new treatments and therapies for ALS. But we don't do it alone, and it was wonderful to share with Team Gleason and Claire this morning an amazing thing that Steve does in the community, not only in legislation, but bringing teams together in research, and all our fabulous partners. It really is a team together. We all have a common goal. It's a global disease. We work globally. We all want to find treatments and a cure. And so with that, this focus this morning is to really highlight the tremendous partnerships we have. I have a wonderful set of colleagues I work with on a very regular basis, and really want to recognize Dr. Amelie Gubis, Dr. Christy Leidy, and Dr. Paul Mehta, who I hope will have the opportunity in their very short, they were tasked with very brief presentations so that we can have discussion to give you a sense of how it is that we partner, and without them and without you going to the Hill tomorrow, we could not succeed, so we're all in it together. And the first presenter will be Amelie Gubis.
Thank you, Lucy, for this very nice introduction. And I'm very excited to be here. And what I'm trying to do over the next few minutes is to give you a brief overview and a snapshot of NIH funding of ALS research. So the first point that I wanted to make is that NIH has a very strong commitment to supporting ALS research. And just to give you a number, for instance, fiscal year 2015, we funded $49 million of ALS research. And on this slide, there are two pie charts, and they give you some information on how NIH supports ALS research. So the first point I wanted to make is that NIH is a very large organization. We are composed of 27 different institutes and centers. And as you can see from this pie chart, the lead institute for ALS research is the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, or in short, NINDS. So NINDS typically funds over 70% of all ALS research grants that are being awarded by the NIH. And these research grants are made to universities and also small businesses across the United States. However, there are also several other institutes at NIH who are very interested in supporting ALS research. So for example, the National Institute on Aging They support ALS research, and they have a very active ALS genetics program in their laboratories up here in Bethesda. And also the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences is supporting ALS research, and they are very interested in environmental health, environmental risk factors of the disease. So across NIH, we work together, but it's typically NINDS that funds the bulk of ALS research. So on the right-hand side, that pie chart gives you a bit of a deep dive into the types of ALS research that NINDS is funding. And the point I really wanted to make is that NINDS funds the full spectrum of ALS research. And as you can see at the bottom of the slide with this chevron diagram, so this starts with basic ALS research. And basic ALS research is the foundational research that seeks to better understand the causes of the disease, how the disease progresses at the cellular and molecular level. And the key point of basic ALS research is to identify potential intervention point for therapies. The next stage of ALS research is translational research, and the goal of translational research is to develop and test new therapies in models of the disease, and Christy is going to talk a little bit about this because this is an area where we are partnering with the CDMRP program at DoD. And then the final stage of ALS research are clinical trials. And as you all know, if a trial has a positive signal, we may get a new drug for the disease. And sort of in between translational research and then the clinical trials, we have a category called biomarkers research. And these are tools or very sensitive readouts that have the potential to accelerate clinical testing of investigational therapies. So as you can see from the pie chart, the biggest investment of NINDS is in basic ALS research. I think this is a really important area for NIH to address. This is the exploratory research. It is quite risky, but on the other hand, it feeds the pipeline for therapy development, and it's probably less likely that the private sector will have a very big investment here. So this is something that really NIH needs to address. The ALS Association also has a very strong investment here, and it's important to keep an eye on the pipeline and make sure that new ideas are being pushed forward. But NINDS also supports translational research, clinical research, and biomarker research. But overall, we are, have the largest investment in the basic discovery research. Okay. So on this slide, I wanted to showcase the benefit of partnerships between funders for ALS research. And the specific example that I'm going to give you today is a program called CREATE. So CREATE is a fairly large clinical study that started about 2.5 years ago, and it includes over 10 clinical sites in the US, and there are also a few foreign sites. And the goal of CREATE is to advance patient-oriented research about ALS. And CREATE is trying to better understand the causes of the disease, how the disease progresses at the symptoms level, and also to discover new biomarkers. And all of these activities are geared and oriented towards therapy development. And across these activities, we have formed very efficient partnerships with other funders in the field. So NIH funds the infrastructure of CREATE and most of the clinical studies. The ALS Association is helping us, and they are funding biomarkers research through CREATE, as well as some of the genetics research. And finally, our newest partner, the National ALS Registry, is now enabling risk factor research for ALS in participants of the studies. So I think by coming together, we've made this effort much more impactful. So another important goal of CREATE is to train young clinical and translational researchers in ALS science. And I think it's really important to always think about the next generation of ALS researcher and to recruit talent early. And this is exactly what CREATE is trying to do. We want to show young investigators how important ALS research is, how exciting it is, and also how many opportunities there are. And then finally, CREATE has also developed and is now using a new contact registry. It's called CREATE Connect. And Create Connect is for patients who live with the disease, for their friends and family members. It provides information about ongoing and upcoming clinical studies in the disease. People can sign up for these studies and participate. And also Create Connect provides information about scientific advances. So I'm just going to close with a few take-home messages. So as I just highlighted with the CREATE program, I think that partnerships between funders of ALS research, including the federal funders, the ALS Association, and also other non-for-profit groups, is absolutely instrumental for moving the field forward. Secondly, I always regard ALS as a very opportunity-rich field. We have really learned a lot about the causes of the disease, how the disease progresses, and right now we have a lot of opportunities. The pipeline for drug development is very robust, and I think it's important to seize the energy in the field and keep the momentum. I also cannot overemphasize how important the participation of patients who live with the disease in the research enterprise is. This is highly valuable, and I think it's the only way that we can solve this very difficult disease. And finally, I also wanted to mention that ALS research funding at NIH has been on an upward trend on the last several years, and I think that's really a reflection of the energy in the field, of the scientific opportunities, and we really want to keep that momentum going. And finally, if you want to learn a little bit more about NIH-funded ALS research, I encourage you to go to our website. There's a section called Report, and there's information about ALS research, and it gives you dollar figures, but you can also look up many of the grants that we are funding and learn more about the research that's currently ongoing. So thank you very much, and I'll hand over to my colleagues.
So good morning, everyone. I'm Christy Leidy. There we are. And I'm the program manager of the ALS research program at the Department of Defense. And I'd first like to thank the ALS Association for inviting me here to talk to you guys about the program at the DoD. So unlike the portfolio you just heard at the NIH, the DoD program is supported by congressional appropriations. It's a $7.5 million appropriation, significantly less than what the NIH has available. Therefore, we focus our research not along the entire spectrum, but in one dedicated space, and that is drug development and filling that clinical pipeline with drugs that are then ready to advance into clinical trial. However, you heard that NIH also funds in that area. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how we collaborate and make sure what we're funding is synergistic and complementary with what's going on at our federal partners. And the way that we do that is by asking Amelie and Lucy and other members of the NIH, including Dr. Brian Traynor, who I believe is here today. If he's not here yet, he will be later, to have a seat at the table with us. And this slide, you can see what we call our programmatic panel. And these are experts in the field, administrators at our federal partner organizations, NIH, as well as the Veteran Affairs. They are our advisory and recommending body. We call them together at least twice a year, and they recommend with others in academia. You can see we have some clinicians and some other senior investigators in academia. We come together and they help us really recommend our focus and our investment strategy for the coming year based on what's happening in their portfolios, what the hottest research is. They also advise us on our program announcement language. So the funding opportunities that we release, they help us hone that in really on the hottest areas in drug development and where we need to be funding and focusing our limited appropriation. They also programmatically evaluate the proposals that come in response to those program announcements. So they make sure that what we're funding is not duplicative, but as I said, is synergistic and complementary with what's going on. at our federal partner agencies. And then lastly, they provide input at critical decision points. So the last point I wanted to make about our programmatic panel is, in addition to the clinicians and the administrators that you see listed here, we also include what we call consumers, which are patients, family members, caregivers. They also have a seat at our table and they have a voice, because we want to hear what is most important to you and what is going to have the biggest impact on the patient community. So we do actively participate, and while I'm up here, I'll take the opportunity to say we'll have a booth in the Research Expo. So if anyone is interested in working with us or how you can help as a consumer, please come see me, and I will have a sign-up sheet there. Okay, so on the next slide, I want to give you some examples of how we collaborate. I know sometimes federal agencies do have the reputation of working in silos, but I'm here to tell you that that does not happen. In addition to having representatives on our programmatic panel, we keep a close eye on the portfolios of the other funders. And this is the drug development pipeline, all the way from basic mechanistic research to clinical trials. Up to 16 years and $1.2 billion is what it takes to bring something from mechanistic research all the way to the clinic and touching patients. So obviously, there's not one of us up here that can do that alone. So we really do have to all work together. So some examples of how we have done that. This first example started as a mechanistic study at NIH looking at the SOD1 mutation and how there's a loss of zinc and/or copper. So following the mechanistic studies, we picked up an investigator called Joseph Beckman at Oregon State University, who developed a copper delivery method to deliver copper to the mutated SOD1. And he made derivatives of this and tested them in an animal model of ALS, also under our funding, and had very promising results. So in parallel, the ALS Association picked up further preclinical testing of these derivatives in a dog model. This then advanced to an early clinical trial funded through industry in Australia. And this trial is ongoing. We and the ALS Association are continuing to fund new derivatives of this copper carrier that we hope to bring to trial here in the US in the coming months. So this is a very exciting example of how the NIH, the ALS Association, and our program at the DoD has worked together to really move a promising idea along the pipeline. So this next example is another early high-throughput screening for molecules that are addressing one of the mutations found in ALS, the TDP43. So we funded an investigator to do high-throughput screening to find compounds that would act on this TDP43 protein. And through this screening, one stood out as a lead therapeutic, and that was pimozide. So we continued to fund we continued to support preclinical studies in a mouse model that showed this pimozide did actually restore function in the mouse model. And this then moved quickly into clinical trial because pimozide is an already FDA-approved compound. So this trial was initiated in Canada and enrolled about 50 ALS patients across Canada. The trial is wrapping up. We are anxiously awaiting the outcome. And at the same time that this was advancing to clinical trial, the ALS Association picked up this idea and is also funding the development of new derivatives of pimozide, hopefully with stronger effects to bring to the clinic here in clinical trials. So these are two really promising examples of how we are all working together to really keep the pipeline full and to move things as quickly as we can to the clinic to touch patients. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, everyone. My name is Paul Maida. I'm with the National ALS Registry, and it's an honor and very humbling moment to be here. I want to thank the association, as well as Barb Newhouse, Colin Neat, and Dr. Bruin as well, and my esteemed colleagues up here as well. I'm going to give you more information about the National ALS Registry, what exactly we do. More importantly, ALS research counts on you. So, with the registry, a lot of people think we just count cases. Hey, we put a report out, this is a report on the prevalence of ALS and so forth. But I think that is important, but that's just one part of what we do in the National ALS Registry. So in this chart right here, it kind of gives you a good idea of exactly all the facets we have of the registry itself. So we have the epidemiology, which means that we're looking at number of cases in the US, number of new cases, number of existing cases. We know in 2013 that there are almost 16,000 cases of ALS in the US. We know ALS affects whites, males, and non-Hispanics more so than any other group. We're just not sure why it affects that group more so than any other group. That's why we also fund research. So with the registry funding research, we fund up 13 studies with ALS research, and those studies are vast. We look at gene-environment interaction. We look at exposures to pesticides. We look at other research such as biomarkers as well. So research is a very, very important part of the registry itself. That's why when I say ALS research counts on you, that certainly hopefully hits home. More importantly, we also work with partners such as the ALS Association and others. Recently, we had the CDC's Public Health Grand Rounds, which was on April 18th this past year. And that event actually garnered almost 20,000 views on Facebook, and it helped to raise awareness of ALS as well as the registry. More importantly, that particular event was the first time ALS was ever in the actual mainstream when it comes to CDC's Public Health Grand Rounds for ALS. So it helped to hopefully garner attention regarding ALS. So the registry as a whole does a lot of stuff. We also do work with research notification systems. So we have a tool in the registry which allows patients to come in and go ahead and sign up and opt in for a notification regarding clinical trials. And so we mentioned clinical trials in this panel. So the registry has actually worked with Cytokinetics on their tirasemtiv clinical trial. We work with Neuraltis on their NP001 clinical trial. So the notification system allows patients who are enrolled in the registry to go ahead and get information on clinical trials and studies. And to date, we have 27 clinical trials and studies we've actually helped recruit for. So certainly, it's one of the facets of the registry which we're very, very excited about. We also have survey data. The survey data itself is what, when someone comes into the registry, they'll go ahead and take surveys. These surveys are vast. And you say, well, why take these surveys? Well, these surveys allow us to kind of figure out what causes ALS. Right now, we're not sure what causes ALS. 90% of ALS is considered sporadic, and 10% is considered genetics. So the survey data itself will certainly go ahead and help us look at surveys, risk factors, potentially occupation, military, exposure to pesticides, traumatic brain injuries, and so forth. So these surveys are certainly very, very important to go ahead and expand ALS research and potentially build hypotheses for what causes ALS. This morning I was reading my Google news feed on ALS, and there was a report or a news article on a patient from Kentucky who is in the room. And this particular patient has 8 generations of ALS in the family. That certainly is very, very tragic and heartbreaking. 8 generations of ALS in the family. So I think what the registry does, it funds research to go ahead and look at genetics, what causes ALS and so forth. I didn't mention the National ALS Biorepository. I have some slides for that. But the National ALS Biorepository is the newest addition to the registry. And the biorepository we're very, very excited about. We feel it's going to go ahead and expand ALS research and biomarkers and environmental exposures and so forth. So the biorepository has launched. Hopefully many of you have heard about the biorepository. If not, we have a couple booths here as well in the atrium right here. We can answer your questions. So the biorepository is very unique. And the goal of the biorepository, like I mentioned, is to expand ALS research. Our enrollment annually, our goal is 675 in-home collections and 10 postmortem collections. We've already begun enrollment, and if you have any questions, we work with the chapters to go ahead and get the message out about the biorepository. But the biorepository will be very unique. So currently there are other repositories out there for ALS tissue samples around the country, but ours will be linked with the survey data itself. So all those surveys we have, over 60,000 surveys taken from patients, will be linked to to those the samples themselves. So potentially, we'll have patients who are in the biorepository, will have their occupational history, will have their military history, and so forth. That information will be matched, and that those samples will be disseminated to researchers across the country to go ahead and further expand ALS research. One other unique thing about the biorepository, this is a free service for patients who want to go ahead and join the biorepository. We will come to your home. We'll go ahead and collect your samples, blood, urine, and saliva, and we'll go ahead and do this free of charge to go ahead and have you, help contribute your samples and help expand ALS research. Like I mentioned, with the biorepository itself, we are very, very excited. This will expand ALS research in genetics, biomarkers, as well as disease progression. For example, recently there was an article on P75 as a protein marker for disease progression that was recently discovered. This protein marker is something that we're hoping that could possibly see in a clinical trial how a patient progresses. So the biorepository will certainly go ahead and help to potentially identify new biomarkers as well. We also, as in terms of with the biorepository, we want to make this the largest biorepository for ALS samples in the world. And probably in 3 to 5 years, our goal is to have these samples available. Actually, these samples are already available for researchers, but in 3 to 5 years, this most likely will be the largest repository of ALS tissue samples in the world. And these will be pristine tissue samples. So a lot of the repositories these days, they're potentially leftover samples from other clinical trials or studies. These are untouched, pristine samples for researchers to go ahead and get and do research on these samples. This right here is a schematic of the actual biorepository itself and how it works. So as you can see, the biorepository is in the center, and the samples come in from patients, whether it's in-home collection or whether it's the post-mortem collection. And these samples are then married or conjoined with our survey data. And so these data will go ahead and be merged with the biorepository samples themselves. And as these samples are merged, we'll go ahead and get them. We do actually also genome testing on them as well. So we actually do, working with our partners at the NIH, we do genotyping. So we determine which samples are potentially SOD1 or C9 and so forth. And these samples are then sent to researchers across the country to go ahead and do further research on the potential causes of ALS. So, very few slides, so.
So thank you to my colleagues for being brief deliberately so that we have time for questions, but I hope you got a real quick sense of what it is that each of the partners do. And again, to remind you, in fact, there's a CREATE booth, so you'll learn much more about CREATE. Dr. Bedlack and his team will be here. Amelie and her team are here with a booth at the expo, so please do join that research expo later so you can more intimately ask your questions. So with that, I'm going to lead off with a few questions, and because our time is limited, I will keep my discussion with the panel a little briefer so that we can also anticipate some questions from the audience. And Kathleen, how did you want to handle that? Are we going to go around with a mic, or are you going to have So there are cards on the table, am I correct? The cards on the table, or will be at the table, so that you could write your questions and then I can help field them. And that would be probably the most effective use of time. So while you're hearing things and seeing things, make sure you bring your cards to representatives who will be around for your questions. So I'm going to start off, I think that in reality you got a beautiful highlight of some real examples from both Amelie and Christy of how we partnered together. So perhaps this is duplicative, but it still would be nice to say to Amelie, what are 1 or 2 things that you think in your portfolio you're really excited about and how that will impact people in the field today with ALS? And you have your lever here.
I think, yeah, so I'm on mic. So I think there are a couple of new directions in ALS research that are really exciting, and they potentially are going to be extremely impactful. So I think one is a new technology, and it's a technology of gene-specific drugs. And they're called antisense oligonucleotides. It's a bit of a mouthful, but essentially what these drugs can do, they can block a specific gene or modulate a specific gene. And that research started a few years ago, and Lucy already alluded to it, and the ALS community has been able to utilize this new technology to target the SOD1 gene. So early research was funded by NIH, was funded by the ALS Research, and it has now progressed to a private partner, and there's now clinical trials. About However, the cool thing about this technology is that we can now also harness it for other forms of the disease. So there is now a lot of academic research ongoing to test this new class of drugs for other genetics types of the disease, but also for sporadic ALS. So potentially, with this new gene-specific drug class, we'll be able to find treatments for all forms of ALS. So I think this is very exciting, and it also has moved forward with cross-fertilization between other disease fields like spinal muscular atrophy and some of the dystrophies. So I think it really highlights how by working together across disease fields, we can make a lot of progress.
Super, thank you, Amelie. And Christy, did you want to highlight, I think you gave two beautiful examples really of going all the way through the pipeline. Just looking in the portfolio, what is your excitement? If you can still add another one to that.
Sure, absolutely. So in addition to the two, pimazide and the copper carrier that I mentioned that both act on known genetic mutations, we do have another promising combination therapy that is a combination with riluzole, the other FDA-approved therapeutic for ALS. So we funded an investigator out of Jefferson College, Piera Passanelli, to do some work looking at efflux inhibitors. So those are transport mechanisms in your cell's membrane that effectively pump riluzole back out of the cells. So this investigator came to us with a proposal to block that inhibitor, to block that efflux, and in effect raise the bioavailability and therefore efficacy of riluzole. So she demonstrated this in the ALS mouse model with very beautiful, elegant data that was published. And soon after, a pharmaceutical company called Izumi then came back to us with another application saying, well, we can develop this drug, this blocker, this efflux blocker, which is called elacrodar. So they came back to us with a GMP development proposal, and they are ramping up scale production of this pharmaceutical, and they are going to be presenting it to the FDA. So that's another exciting example coming out of our portfolio.
Fantastic. Thank you both for that. I think that's so exciting to see actually the pace of things. You know, there was a time maybe 10 years ago when we would spend a lot of time on very fundamental research, which is critical, but with very little way to move it forward. And I think now the speed at which the research is going, and I know that for you it's alarming to see the 1 to 2 billion and the many, many years in the drug discovery pipeline. I will say, as alluded to with this new technology, the discovery of the C9 mutation and then getting this into clinical trial. The mutation was discovered in 2011. The trial is planned for 2017. That's unprecedented. So I think that there are really ways through these kinds of opportunities that we can maybe move that pipeline much faster than anyone would have predicted. So thank you for those examples. So Paul, I think you highlighted very nicely the many diverse things that the registry does, and you did mention the tool for clinical trials engagement and enrollment. Maybe you can give a very specific example of how that has made an impact, having that kind of a resource in terms of numbers, the challenges we have, but how that has made an impact.
So just to kind of add on to what my colleagues are saying, so last week I had a call with a group out of California, and there's a large group that wants to go ahead and leverage the registry for recruitment for a drug trial. They didn't give me the actual name of the pharma company out in the West Coast. They said it was a big one, so I'm not sure exactly who that was. But the premise is, so our tool itself, our notification tool, has been successful. So we've actually worked with pharma. I mentioned Cytokinetics, I mentioned Neuraltis. We also work with Biogen as well on a survey too. So we're certainly excited about working with pharma to go ahead and help them recruit. For clinical trials, it's very, very expensive to go ahead and have your own patient pool, to get your own patient pool. So our premise is to come to the registry. We can certainly help you recruit, whether it's nationally, whether it's regionally, whether it's just patients who've been newly diagnosed or patients who've been diagnosed for over a year or patients who are on riluzole or so forth. So we can go ahead and leverage that. You mentioned success stories. So we actually work with Cytokinetics for tirasemtiv, and tirasemtiv is one of the new. It's still in clinical trials right now, but the premise is hopefully it'll go ahead and get out of clinical trials and come to market. But we had the medical officer for Cytokinetics come to our meeting last year in Atlanta and to give a presentation on how that helped the company to go ahead and recruit. And she said the minute that notification went out, her inbox was full of individuals replying back to Cyto to go ahead and get information on the clinical trial. And we were able to go ahead and help out with their efforts to go ahead and get the actual patient pool they wanted for that clinical trial itself. For neurologists, for NP001, we helped them out as well. And after that one went out, the notification, I reached out back to them a month later, and they told me that we were also very, very helpful with that notification to go ahead and help recruit for their drug as well. So we're certainly excited about the notification system to help pharma to expand clinical trials and to go ahead and build those synergies with our partners here.
Great, thank you, Paul. So Amelie, a question, and making sure we're not implying any lobbying here, but a question is very different to what is happening in ALSRP. We've got sort of dollars that are dedicated for ALS. At NIH, there are no specific disease dedications. But how do we benefit from the portfolio at NIH beyond what's put in ALS specific?
I mean, I think what's really important is to train new investigators and really pay attention to our training programs and make sure that there is a lot of interest in ALS research being generated. And I think that's where our partnership with the ALS Association works so well. So you, for instance, fund startup grants. These are smaller grants for smaller amounts, but it enables younger researchers or sometimes researchers later in the career who want to try an idea in ALS to generate initial data, we call it preliminary data, and that then enables them to apply to the NIH with a much bigger grant proposal and that then get potentially funding for over 5 years. So I think the idea of seed funding is really critical to have a very active and vibrant and growing ALS research community. And I think, so in general, although sort of NIH has an open competition between diseases, actually the peer review system where grant applications are being reviewed by other researchers, it's actually been working really well for ALS. And I think it's just a reflection of the quality of ALS research and the new ideas and the energy. So over the past several years, I mentioned that we had a slight increase in our NIH funding in ALS, and I think it's just a reflection of the scientific opportunities that we currently have. So although we don't have money earmarked, there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of momentum, and I really want to make sure that we keep that up.
Fantastic, thank you, Amelie. It's great to partner in that way. Christy, a question I often get, people ask, well, why is it at the DoD where, of course, we've been able to champion this kind of program because ALS is more prevalent in the military. How is this benefiting for the military? And, what about the rest of ALS? It's kind of the question I get if I've paraphrased it reasonably well.
Right, that's a really good question, and I often get it too. And studies do continue to show that if you serve in the military, you're twice as likely to develop ALS. And really the ALS that we see in our military veterans is not different than the ALS that we see in the general population. So there is a priority for finding treatments, and those treatments are gonna help all ALS patients, including our military veterans.
What I wanted you to express, thank you. So finally, from my perspective, before we get into a few of the questions, maybe you could just, because there's so much information always, and I wanted to be sure that the panel today was not too complicated for you with numbers and figures. So what is a take-home message that you would give people for their day tomorrow on the Hill, not as an advocate plug, but as just a thinking about, well, when you talk about NIH, what should they be thinking of? When you talk about the registry, what is the message you would like to bring, even if you're repeating what you've already said? What is your take-home message for them?
I mean, to me, it's really a time of scientific opportunity, and I think it is important that NIH continues to support the basic research. We are likely not going to get a lot of private sector investments in the basic research, but this is sort of the engine that keeps the machine running. So I think the investment of NIH in the foundational research continues to be so important, and I think it's the only way that we are going to get to new therapies.
Thank you, Amelie. Christy.
Oh, and I agree, and I also think that just collaboratively working together, all of us on this stage. I mean, not one of our agencies are going to be able to do this alone. So how much we're interacting and working together to keep the pipeline full. Of course, our program focuses on the middle, whereas NIH funds the basic, the middle, and clinical trials. But we are collaboratively working to keep that pipeline full, and we take our mission very seriously.
Thank you. Paul?
So my take-home message would be there are more unknowns than knowns about ALS at this point. So we need to figure out what causes this disease. And so as a public health scientist, you know, the CDC, ATSCR, what we do is we want to go ahead and get to the heart of who gets ALS and what causes ALS. And so that's very, very important. We need to figure out what's causing this disease and how we can go ahead and figure out, is it possible exposure to something? Is it dealing with the environment? So the premise is we want to go ahead and figure out etiology, causation of the disease itself. And so I think the take-home message for at least as in terms of ALS on the registry side is we're promoting ALS research. We're expanding ALS research to go ahead and figure out what causes this disease.
So thank you very much for your comments. I'm going to try, so as you see, I've got many, many questions and very little time to do that. So I'm going to pick out a few. I apologize if I didn't get your question answered from the ones you've put here. 2 messages. All of my colleagues are available and they have booths, so please go and ask them these various questions. The other is that I will work with all of these questions, put them into a document, and work with my public policy team to make sure that you get those questions answered. It will help us also identify which are the areas that we need more information for you on, so thank you for that. And with that, I'm going to try and tackle a few of these, and I know that the panel might not have all the expertise to answer every single question I have here. If I understand correctly, the question is, what is the mechanism procedure of post-mortem collection for the biorepository? Obviously, that's a question for Paul, but also do remember that his team are out here and would be very interested to hear from you if you're interested. So, Paul, can you try and help with that in very brief?
So first, to go and join the biorepository, you must first be in the registry itself. So when you join the registry, there's a section where you'll go ahead and say you want more information on the biorepository. We'll collect your information, and a packet will be mailed out to you. In about a week or so, we'll go ahead and contact you for information, to provide you information about the in-home collection, and for those who want to go ahead and do the postmortem collection as well. So hopefully, my colleagues are also outside who can also answer the very, very specific questions about how those processes work. But in general, you must be in the registry to go ahead and get information on the biorepository itself. And so the in-home collection would come first, and then for those who want to go ahead and do the postmortem collection, we can go ahead and give you more information. But please keep in mind, for the postmortem collection, it is 10 collections per year. It is very expensive to do a postmortem collection. So that's why our focus is currently on the in-home collection itself.
And I think you've answered this, but I'm going to state the question again for Christy. Are those involved in DoD studies in the US only veterans?
No, absolutely not. So, well, our program, first of all, does not fund clinical trials, so we do not fund studies with patients. But as I mentioned, the treatments that we're trying to develop will help all ALS patients. We're not specifically focused on military veterans.
If I could quickly add to that right there. So the registry also works with the VA to go ahead and get their data regarding ALS cases too. But we also fund research on veterans as well. So Dr. Mark Weisskopf out of Harvard, he's one of the original authors about the risk factors to veterans, which came out in the early 2000s. So we actually fund his research as well to look at what sort of factors that may play into veterans getting ALS.
Then there is a question here, and I think it's really a more technical thing, which I'm sure you can answer in terms of, so how recently deceased does a person with ALS need to be involved in the biorepository? That's for tissue collection. Maybe you want to highlight, there are specifics and protocols, but...
Yeah, so the premise is, we can give you all the information regarding the postmortem collection itself, but our team actually works with the patient and the patient's family to see how things are progressing. And not to get too morbid or not to get too down, we certainly, work closely with that particular patient's family, and pretty much upon death, they'll go ahead and let us know, and we'll go ahead and take the necessary measures to go ahead and send out the individual who will go ahead and do the work that needs to be done. But the actual, I think there's a certain time window, maybe between less than 12 hours from time of death to go and do the postmortem collection itself. So not to get too morbid, I'm sorry.
And there's sort of a few more registry questions. Again, I tried to avoid numbers and details, but maybe you can help a little here. The question here is, what percentage of the total number of ALS cases do you estimate to be represented in the registry? And I know what might be...
Sure. I think this is a very, very important question. So we're a surveillance system, which means that with the surveillance system, we can't capture all the cases of ALS. ALS is very unique. So if I gave you the example of HIV, tuberculosis, or an STI, those are notifiable diseases, which means they're notified to the state health departments, which in turn will go and tell CDC who gets the disease and how many cases are there for a particular state. ALS, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, these are non-notifiable diseases, and therefore, we're not sure exactly, so we have an algorithm that we have to go ahead and do the case ascertainment, to go ahead and calculate how many number of cases of ALS there are in the United States. As a surveillance system, we know we can't capture all the cases. So we are missing cases from the HMOs. We are missing cases from private insurance. That information, that data is available to us. However, that data does not have PII, which is personal identifiable information. We can't match someone who's, let's say, in getting Blue Cross Blue Shield wherever, let's say in Maine. I can't match up that person's case to my case to simply say, hey, that person's in there, because we don't have their PII information. So that certainly makes it much more difficult for us. We are currently also working with a group out of Stanford, Dr. Lorraine Nelson, to do capture-recapture, which is an epidemiological methodology which estimates the number of missing cases. So we're currently working on that to go ahead and get approximate the percentage of missing cases for ALS. We know right now, as of 2013, there were almost 16,000. In 2014, that number will most likely go up. So, but the premise is, we know as a surveillance system, we can't capture all the cases, but we do have ways to go ahead and mitigate that by doing capture-recapture and estimating the number of percentage of cases we're missing.
So it just really emphasizes a point. I think there are at least 5 or 6 questions, and I had a quick question in the hall. Obviously, the number that we say is the number of cases of ALS is based on and is an estimate. So obviously, maybe nuancing that number with that caveat might be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me just say this. I think numbers are important, but one case or 1,000 cases or 100,000 cases of ALS, that one case of ALS is the most important case to you. So the premise is, I think we need to go beyond the numbers. Numbers are important for public health, for guys like me to see exactly what the prevalence are. What's the prevalence? But I think we have to go beyond the numbers and see, what can we do to go and identify risk factors for ALS? What causes this disease? That's critically important. And what sort of therapeutics are out there, whether it's the new one from MT Pharma or whether it's a new one from some other drug company coming out there. I think that's very important. When you get kind of like stuck on numbers, sometimes, you're kind of looking through a microscope. Well, what numbers are these? I know there's numbers up to 20,000, up to 30,000. But the bottom line is, one case of ALS is too many, in my opinion.
I will add to that, because I think, and again, it was a conversation, the passage, in terms of the industry being incentivized, one might have thought at the time that, Alzheimer's, big disease, affects 1 in 3 at a certain age, actually, those have not necessarily got more treatments than other diseases. And in fact, we are now working with the concept of precision medicine, where we know we're going to be tailoring medicines, like in cancer, to much smaller groups of patients. I think that, in fact, being a small or focused area does not impact the enthusiasm of the industry. It's being able to know how to have a target. So the example that Amelie showed and that I mentioned with the C9 mutations, 1 in 10 people with ALS will carry that mutation. That does not disincentivize Biogen at all from developing that. In fact, there's great enthusiasm because it's a very clear, defined target. And the small number is not the limitation. In fact, the small number is not a problem for the clinical trial, because it's going to need much smaller studies, because it's a very defined target that we're targeting. So numbers is all relative, and certainly this particular number does not diminish the excitement or enthusiasm from the industry to invest in ALS. I think I have time for 2 more questions. One I'm going to address at the end. The other is a question I actually also get too, and it's a sort of a mix between Christy and Paul to comment. So if we think there's a military connection, And, you know, we're still struggling what those environmental influences might be. Do we know anything about those in the military outside of the US and the numbers there? So it's twofold in the US, but so I think maybe the challenge is that it's the deployed and undeployed that get ALS, so it's particularly the population in the military, or is it their environment? And we don't know the answers, nor do I, but...
Yeah, that's certainly, so anyone who's served, I know it's a service-connected disease itself, so I believe you have to be there at least 30 days to be a service-connected disease for ALS itself. So the premise is whether you're deployed or not deployed, I think there are certain studies have shown folks who are in certain theaters of war, whether it's the Gulf War, Part 1 or Part 2, the premise is they have a higher risk of getting ALS than those who are not serving. So certainly there are variables in play, whether you're serving in the front lines or whether potentially you're at the base or something.
So I'm going to close with two questions, which are really big topics to tackle, and I'm not going to have all the perfect answers, but I hope that I can explain them. I apologize in advance for the many, many questions that I couldn't cover. Some are about radicavis, so we have that pleasure of having an opportunity in a moment. But there are two questions that I think are important to address. One question is from someone clearly frustrated, rightly so. Why is it so hard to participate in drug trials? I have tried and tried. So there's no simple answer to that. I'm certainly not the clinician, and we didn't set up a panel of clinicians today. I would encourage you to go and chat to my colleagues, Dr. Traynor, Dr. Bedlack. We are all for trying to get people into clinical trials. I always say it like a scientific experiment. A clinical trial is also an experiment. You want to do the best experiment to succeed, and there therefore have to be certain criteria in that clinical trial. That said, as a participant, and being in a clinical trial doesn't guarantee that you're going to have a better projection, because the treatment may or may not work. It's just an experiment. But you all should feel empowered and encouraged that you can all be part of research. Your contribution by being involved in a registry, by being involved in providing samples, if you have families that carry mutations that are at the moment the C9, the SOD1, you might not want to know the genetic demise of your family members. You can be involved in studies where you don't have to do that. Speak to our colleagues, speak to Dr. Bedlack. There are ways that you can be involved, be it an ambassador for our programs, being what you've already done, being on the Hill. So you should all feel that every one of you can be involved in research, and there is a way to do that. For details of why you can't be in a trial, it's very specific to each individual trial, and we can help you there. Carly Doyle is here as part of our NEALS network, who is our trial expert or links you to all the people. So you should feel empowered to find out, get involved, and you're really much a part of this whole enterprise. The second and final thing, because I think it's a very valid question, is that there seem to be so many registries. Why one? Why another? We all like to say we're going to have the biggest and the best. I think combined we are going to have brilliant registries. You'll hear a lot more about the Connect registry. You've heard about the National Registry. Answer ALS is a big data collection enterprise. Project Mine, GTEC. The ALS Association is partnered to all of these activities. There are very many different ways which we try and integrate. We as a scientific and collegial community are always interconnecting. There are actual physical instruments like a global identifier. There is common sequencing. There is common clinical collections. So where it is possible, we work with all these teams, and every single project has its value and its place, and built together, even globally, we have a real opportunity of tackling difficult questions. ALS is not the same for one person as another. How can we start to think about precision medicine and apply that into clinical trial design? How can we segregate the community of patients into trials more cleverly so we can get a better readout? Nobody in our audience here has all the answers. We are crunching out huge data, which we also need partners in IBM and Microsoft and Google to help us resolve. But be assured, as you see here, our colleagues here, we're a team together. We don't have the answers, but we are building the answers through collaboration and through your participation, whether you're a caregiver, someone who funds the research, whether you work in industry, whether you're living with the disease. So thank you so much for your attention. We hope we can answer your questions either in the conversations around coffee or by email or communication. And thank you so much to our fabulous panel.
Pleasure of introducing a woman that has helped to move this community forward, and with our guidance as well as this new approval that happened just last week. So I want to welcome Dr. Janet Woodcock, the director of the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, also known as CDER, at FDA. And really, Dr. Woodcock, we had the pleasure of meeting just a couple of weeks ago to talk about clinical trial design. So I can assure you that not only is the agency, but also Dr. Woodcock very involved and hands-on on trying to solve a lot of these questions and a lot of these issues. So the center, in case you don't know, the center does evaluate prescription and over-the-counter drugs before they can be sold, and oversee their testing and the clinical trials. They provide healthcare professionals and patients the information they need to use medicines wisely. They ensure that drugs, both brand name and generic, work correctly and that their health benefits outweigh their known risks. And they take action against unapproved, contaminated, and fraudulent drugs that are marketed illegally. Now, Dr. Woodcock previously served as the FDA's Deputy Commissioner and Chief Medical Officer, and she also led CDER as the director from 1994 to 2005. Dr. Woodcock oversaw the approval of the first biotech-based treatments for MS, cystic fibrosis, and in her position as the director of the Office of Therapeutics and Research and Review in FDA's Center of Biologic Evaluation and Research. So please help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Janet Woodcock from the FDA. Thank you so much. And just to let you know, once Dr. Woodcock is done speaking, we will have 2 microphones around the room for about 15 minutes or so to help answer questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for that introduction. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to speak to you today. I have long spoken out about the key role of patients and patient advocate activism in improving disease outcomes and driving toward cures. The ALS Association, I think, really exemplifies these activities and activism. Many patient groups very properly focus on 2 critical activities. The first is supporting people to get the treatments they need and the support they need and to care for them. And the second is funding biomedical research to advance treatments for those diseases. The ALS Association takes care of both of these extremely well, support to the patients, and also supporting cutting-edge research in the laboratory. And so this is critically important. And I believe that the ALS Association certified treatment centers of excellence is really a best practice for a rare complex disease. And a few other associations have managed this. And I believe they've really elevated the care level of their disease by driving excellence in care. So this is extremely important. And the support of research in this area is outstanding. The ice bucket challenge was extremely innovative. That was a great coup, I think, to pull that off and really get money in. And, you know, you have discovered more implicated genes through this funding. And frankly, to drive toward a cure, it's totally important that we understand the basic cause of this disease, what is causing people to come down with this disease so we can address it directly. But of course, that still leaves the question of actually getting treatments and cures developed. And there, a lot of patient groups don't have the bandwidth to work on that. Traditionally, this was left to the industry, and of course, for rare diseases, there was not that much interest often in focusing on that, particularly when you didn't understand the cause of the disease. But increasingly, we realize that the people in rare disease need to contribute in this area. If you really want to drive toward better treatments and cures, you need to be in there pushing on what we call a translational science. In other words, getting that basic science moved through the pipeline and into actual treatments in the clinic. So in that role of advocacy would be to push development along, encourage data sharing, and make research networks. So I think the registries that were talked about and the sharing of information, that's really an important part of translation. We have been urging folks with rare diseases to do this for a long time, develop natural history studies, develop biorepositories, so that there's an opportunity then to understand the disease and also design better clinical trials. But another role of the advocacy community can be to interact with the regulators about the importance of disease and how to actually study it and what the standards should be, say, for approval of treatments for that disease. Now, on May 5th, the FDA approved Radicava or edaravone for treatment of ALS, as you all already know. And this approval came after FDA approached the firm and really asked them to submit an application. And I think the FDA's interaction we'd been having with the community over the last few years really raised our awareness and the need and really helped us take that extra step and contributed to the result that you see of another additional approved therapy in 22 years for this disease. However, one of the most innovative efforts the association has made is the draft guidance on ALS drug development. This was submitted to FDA earlier, and we're working on getting our draft finalized and getting our part of the process done. But the ALS Association document really is, to quote the words of our head of neurology, is a superb document. It is superb. It harnessed the thinking of the best minds across many areas of expertise, including patients and caregivers. It reflects state-of-the-art thinking about the disease and how to evaluate new interventions from the point of view of experts in different areas like statistics, but also from the point of view of people with the disease or those caring for people with the disease, who also, we know, have major expertise into the disease. So the ALS Association guidance also included a comment period that they ran, and this allowed it to be strengthened and provided transparency, and actually has made the FDA's task easier, because that document is now out there as a reference for the community and for drug developers and for everyone to learn from. Although the FDA's guidance is not out there, the association's document provides guideposts and important inputs for developers and other interested parties. And one of the impetuses for doing this is to provide that pathway to marketing to help attract developers into the area. So congratulations, it's really a huge achievement. And it shows how collaborative science is needed to advance therapeutics. Current research tends to be siloed and somewhat isolated and occurs in pockets excellence around the world, and it's really often the patient associations that bring that research together if you have enough bandwidth to do that and really help move it along. Now, we hope to get the ALS guidance out faster, but the neurology division is really busy. And this is extremely good news because neurology was kind of a backwater for a very long time as far as therapeutics might go, and approving seizure drugs and the occasional symptomatic treatment for Parkinson's disease. But right now, the field of neurodegeneration is extremely active. We have numerous INDs, numerous investigational programs going on. And this tends to spread out over multiple different diseases, not just focused on one. So I think that's great news in this area. Not only did we just approve a drug for ALS, we approved a drug called nusinersen, which is one of those antisense oligonucleotides that was just referred to by the prior panel. And that drug was for spinal muscular atrophy. And it was approved for all forms, for the infantile form in which the major trial was done, but also for forms that progress slower or manifest in later in development. And so that is really a landmark, the first approval of an oligosense antinucleotide like that for a neurodegenerative disorder. The year before that, we had approved a drug for a specific form of muscular dystrophy. There was also a genetic directed at genes that were not acting the way they normally should and causing the disease. So this is, I agree with the previous panel, this is an extremely promising area. These are very targeted therapies, but to develop therapies such as this, you have to understand the gene that you're going after. And that goes back to why the registries and the biorepositories are so important. But once you discover a gene and you can, now with today's technology, you can quickly develop a therapy, potential therapy, but then you have to evaluate it, and that's where the guidance comes in. How do you evaluate these therapies most effectively and shorten that translation from 10 to 15 years to maybe a few years, if at all possible. So finally, I'd like to give a word about expanded access to investigational therapies or experimental therapies. I know people are very interested in this, and it's a very confusing issue. We call this expanded access, meaning the previous panel talked about how you get into a clinical trial, okay? And often they have certain criteria and they aren't very large, and so not everyone can be in a clinical trial. But there may be other ways to get access to a drug while it's undergoing investigation. Now, I have long believed, and I've testified this before Congress, that people with serious or fatal diseases that don't have adequate therapies should be able to take investigational drugs as long as they are fully informed about the risks and uncertainties that pertain to that drug. So they're going in with eyes wide open. And the Center for Drugs and FDA really does operate that way. We approve almost all requests that we get for what we call expanded access. In other words, treatment outside of a clinical trial of a drug that's not yet approved. Okay, so that is a possible route for people to get access if they can't get in a clinical trial. But there are barriers, and I'm well aware of them, and the following are barriers. First of all, healthcare practitioners often don't have time, training, or funding to administer an experimental drug. In other words, there's a lot of effort around that, and people are not trained how to do that. And sometimes insurance, of course, it won't cover the investigational drug, which usually is not charged for, okay, but it may not cover any of the other activities around that investigational drug, whether you need certain testing or what have you, so it might be expensive. Drug developers may not release the drug for this kind of use, and that's typically a barrier. The drug companies often only make a little of the drug, enough to test in clinical trials, and so they want to get the clinical trials done. Then if they get approval, then everybody can have access and they'll go into broad production. But many of these drugs, especially these antisense oligos and similar, are very hard to make. And so they're not going to make large quantities of them. So that's a barrier to getting the drug. There are other issues and reasons that companies may not give out the drug. And actually, the Supreme Court ruled quite a long time ago, they ruled that there's no inherent ability of people to get drugs from people, their property, if they don't want to give them. So, you know, the drug companies do control that drug that they're developing. Now, there's also a IRB, Institutional Review Board, and under current procedures, you have to get when you're getting an experimental drug, or even in a clinical trial, or on this expanded access, you have to get IRB approval. Who's ever giving it to you, your investigator must get IRB approval, and there's an informed consent process that goes along with that, and that's to make sure you are eyes wide open about the risks, what has happened to other people who took this, right, and so forth. And then there's other paperwork. We've tried to make the FDA paperwork minimal. It's mainly on the investigator who has to send in some paperwork. Takes, we think, about 45 minutes to fill it in, but then they have all this other things they have to do, and people often are worried about liability, medical legal liability, although it very rarely has been an issue. So currently, Congress and the states, some states have passed right to try legislation, and Congress has some drafts, you know, that people have talked about. This is very well intentioned, I think, but people do need to know what has happened to other people when they were given the experimental drug. I think that's a really critical thing, that making that choice and taking an experimental drug, you surely should know what has happened before. Have people died right after taking it? Have they had terrible side effects? You want to, as an autonomous person, be able to be able to weigh those potential benefits of the drug against what you know has happened to people who have taken the drug. So I think ALS Association can help with these types of issues, with its access to experts, you know, should these issues arise. And so that's another benefit of having an association that is very savvy and has a lot of connections to experts. It's very difficult for individual patients or even practitioners alone to figure out how to navigate this system. And in cases where a drug has looked very promising and the company's willing, what the FDA tries to do is get the company to open what we call an access protocol. Okay, and then all these things I talked about really are not an issue. There's a central IRB involved. The company manages the access and most of the paperwork. And so the company simply provides that drug for treatment. And we've had protocols where literally tens of thousands of people have been treated under these kind of access protocols. So this is very possible, but that would be the case probably where really promising drugs come along, the clinical trials are getting done or are finished, and you know, people want access to that drug, then that's perfectly doable. In summary, I think I agree with the previous speakers. This is a really exciting time in the history of neurodegenerative diseases. We can see some light at the end of this tunnel. We can see that we can figure out what causes these and then devise therapies that can ameliorate these conditions. But we all know that people with ALS have little time. That time is of the essence. We need to redouble our efforts on natural history, on registries, on getting the science done, and also the translational medicine related to ALS, so that we have the smoothest operating machine possible. As soon as those scientific discoveries occur in the laboratory, they can be moved forward and evaluated as quickly as possible. So FDA, with passage of the Cures Act by Congress, 21st Century Cures Act, in December of 2016, has a broadened mission acknowledged by Congress. And that includes what we call patient-focused drug development, something we've been doing for a while, but now Congress has really assigned that to us as part of our mission. And that means we keep the patient in mind at all times. The needs of the patients are kept in mind as we craft drug development programs and we set up the requirements for what the bar is to getting onto the market. So we will be working very closely with patient groups to define those standards. And I think the guidance, the draft guidance we got from the ALS Association is really best in class of an example of how to do this right, how to get the patient's voice right in there, along with the assessments of the experts and the expert input and so forth, to make sure the patients are adequately and fully represented in developing those standards. And FDA really, it remains committed to working with the community to ultimately find treatments and ultimately cures for this disease. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm happy to take questions.
So, Dr. Woodcock, is it your opinion then that we're going to have a better chance at seeing right to try through the states, the individual states passing it, or eventually Congress?
Well, I'm not allowed to, as a federal employee, I can't really comment on federal legislation. I was just simply saying that the U.S. Congress has been talking about this as well as the states. Yeah.
Well, thank you for explaining the barriers.
Yeah, the barriers are important, and that's where a strong patient organization, advocacy organization can help deal with a lot of those barriers. You can set up central IRBs or have relationships with them. You can do many things, and I'm sure this powerful association will do those, or has, should the case arise, to assist people, even if a very large access program is needed. In fact, we had one situation a long time ago where we were going to approve a drug, but the quantity was limited, and so we had the association ran a lottery, and so it was fair access. People got into that lottery. That actually contributed to the data on the effectiveness of the drug at the end of the day.
I'm Craig from Texas, and I believe you touched on some of it about the expanded access program. And you're right, there are barriers. No doctor that I've talked to wants anything to do with it. They don't want to be associated with it at all. What can the FDA do to help us get access to medications? It seems like a good deal on the surface, but when you have medical doctors that no one wants to touch it, from Mayo Clinic to St. Luke's to Baylor Scott and White in Texas, no one wants anything to do with it at all. How can the FDA help us as pals get access to medications that we're desperate for?
Well, as I said, most of these barriers I've mentioned are related to, like, the state of our healthcare system. The doctors are busy. Sometimes they're concerned about the therapy that you might want to use. What we have, we've been working with the Reagan-Udall Foundation, which is a nonprofit that is established to help the FDA, and they're trying to set up a navigator function for cancer patients who frequently have this problem, and their problem is not being able to identify which drug they would would be best for them to be on, or how to figure out whether it's available. Your problem is that the problem you are describing is a little bit different, which is that you can't find people in the healthcare system willing to administer this. So if that's really the problem, it's not the company not willing to provide the drug, right? Then I think if the company is willing to provide the drug, you might talk to them about setting up an open label protocol. That's what I was talking about a minute ago. A treatment protocol is opened. It's a clinical trial, a clinical study, but it only has the active treatment in it. It doesn't have a control arm. And its purpose is more exposure of patients and also to provide them with potential treatment. These are often done as part of development programs to increase our understanding of the safety of a therapy. And so they are useful, especially when companies are doing very small, focused, randomized clinical trials to find out whether the treatment works or not. So that would be, if the company is willing to give out the agent, whatever the agent is, then talking about something like that might be a good avenue. It would relieve the practitioners of any burden because the company then runs that protocol. But I think you need to figure out, why are these experts unwilling? Are they unwilling because they feel there's problems with the intervention, or are they unwilling because they can't spend the time and effort needed to do a single patient protocol, which puts all the burden on that investigator? Or is their institution unwilling to enable them to do this? You have to do some detective work to find out what the actual barriers are in your case, or the case that you're talking about. Sure.
Thank you, Doctor, for coming and talking to us today. My name is John from New York. Question I have is, how can we assure continuity to the great programs that the FDA is involved with from administration to administration?
Well, that's a good question. Generally speaking, the career civil servant level, more or less at FDA, really runs most of the programs. For example, I've run the drugs program for a very long time. And despite what people think and say about the different political level, which is necessary, they actually aren't involved in ordinary day-to-day decisions about drugs. Or if they are, it's extremely rarely. So the real issue might be if there were a lot of cuts that we had to contract our efforts. That would be an issue. The Center for Drugs is funded primarily by user fee programs, and those are all moving through Congress right now. But we do have some taxpayer dollar funding too. And so we do rely upon our resources to make sure we can do the things that we need to do. But as far as I know Scott Gottlieb, who's the new FDA commissioner, very well, and I think he would be right in line with the efforts that we're doing here that I've been describing today.
Nancy, I have a mic right here.
My name is Nancy Frades, and I'm the mother of a 32-year-old ALS patient. He's had ALS for 5 years. His name's Pete Frades. I was honored to be one of the participants in February of 2013 that spoke to the neurological panel at the FDA. And I want to thank the FDA for the approval of Radicava and those to come. My question is, in our community, we deal with, care versus cure.
Right.
And my son was in the hospital last year with, a very typical sepsis because he had so much infection. When he left the hospital up at Mass General, they put him on a nebulizer And we employ private care nurses, which is a whole nother can of worms, which I won't open up. But because we have private care nursing in our home, they can administer the 28 days of nebulizer that he needs, the atobyomycin, and then 28 days off. Well, because he's being treated in the home, the way the FDA approved the drug, it was only approved for CF. So we don't get it covered. It costs us $7,000 a month to have this treatment. Well, since Pete's been put on this treatment, he has not been back in the hospital, which Medicare would pick up if he went back in the hospital. Now, this is a catch-22, because if we put him in the hospital, which he would have to be put in the RAC-U, they would cover the $7,000 for the nebulizer. So they would cover $200,000 for the 28 days, but not the $7,000 because we're private paying at home. How do we go about when, as you said, there's so much momentum in our community that doctors are finding these care symptomatic treatments that maybe are used in other, because we have such a complex disease and we need so many different specialties to come in to help the treatment and care of our patients. How do we enact change to say, hey, wait a minute, this works on ALS and it works incredibly well when you say that he hasn't been in the hospital for 10 months. How do we get that changed?
You could talk to the company that submitted the atobyomycin application to the FDA and see if, in fact, they could send in, if you have enough data on and off, resolve, had pneumonia resolved, so forth. They could gather up enough data to submit a labeling supplement, change the label. Wow, that's great. Yes, well, they do. Yeah, right now, if you can get, I'm sorry, I assumed you tried that, but yeah, if you can get patient assistance, that's great. But then if Novartis has enough people on this and they're having the same results, I think submitting for a label supplement would be a good idea. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Amanda from Chicago, Illinois. Wanted to say thank you so much for being here and for all your information that you shared with us. My question really relates to the expanded access for the clinical trials. How long have you seen it take, either a date range or a time, to break down those barriers? Is it a couple years? Has it been 3 to 5 months? And that really stems from my husband was diagnosed with ALS, and he passed after receiving his diagnosis within 9 months at the age of 26. And so that was something that we couldn't get into any clinical trials. We had a week-by-week milestone that got taken away from him. And so that's where my question stems from.
Well, it depends on the pipeline, all right? Where are treatments in development? How robust are they? How far along are they? Then it depends, is the company willing to run an access program? Where companies are willing and set up access programs, and it's quite easy to get into them, okay, usually. But they may be limited, as I said, due to supply of the drug or other things. And with the new targeted therapies, it'll depend on the genetics. So you might have to have a specific genetic defect to enter into a certain trial because the drug is only directed at that particular genotype. But if you're on your own, in other words, there's no access program, if you talk to the company, the first thing is have your doctor find a willing doctor, as somebody else said. That's number one, okay? And I don't know how long that takes. Maybe at the centers of excellence, they're more willing to, or whatever. The second is have a doctor talk to the company. If you have a drug you've identified, have them talk to the company. If they're not willing to give it out, then you have a problem. Okay, it's not a time problem. It's that they, for reasons of lack of supply or other reasons, they're not entertaining these. If they're entertaining it and your doctor's willing, then there are 2 more steps. One is talk to the FDA and then get it through your doctor has to get this through an IRB. Okay, and sometimes That's expensive, depending on what system the physician belongs into and what kind of IRB he needs to go to, and that might take quite some time. Although there are expedited clearances. Now, when people are really ill, we often give a yes on the phone and then ask for the paperwork later, and then the IRB may give an expedited approval. But for a case where a person has an illness, you know, and they're stable and deteriorating slowly, then they'll have to go through a process. The FDA process won't take very long, but the IRB process might take a while. So those are the major steps, and how long it takes depending. If there are other people, if the company has a protocol, it doesn't need to take long at all.
Hi, my name is Shelley Hoover. I'm from California. I'm a veteran, been living with ALS almost 5 years. I have a neurologist who's very willing to give me access either through Right to Try or expanded access. He doesn't care. The problem that I'm running into, and I've worked very closely with patient-centric trials, and from every different angle and every different relationship I can develop. Time and time again, when I speak to folks who are designing trials or working for pharmaceutical companies, say that there is nothing but risk for the pharmaceutical companies, and the pushback I'm getting from them is the FDA would simply tell us that if we participate in expanded access or Right to Try, it won't jeopardize our trial and our seeking approval. They'd be much more willing. So there is no incentive, there is only risk. And we as an ALS community are hearing another no from another angle. So what is it gonna take for the patient community and our advocates to stop hearing no and start hearing yes to an answer that's going to save our lives?
Yeah, well, we looked over the years, okay, and there has never been a case where an expanded access program prevented an approval. There have been a couple cases where we learned something very serious about the drug during expanded access. That was put into the informed consent and so forth, so the other people who took the drug would know that that could happen, but it didn't prevent approval of the drug. And we've had a couple cases, one I alluded to earlier, where the expanded access program actually provided some of the evidence that got the drug onto the market. So the alternative, which people are considering, is that nobody learns about what happens to people on expanded access. So you would be taking a drug, and the last 10 people may have died after they took the drug, but nobody would know, because then nobody would know. So
I've already taken the risk in a phase 1 trial, and one of the first humans to take the drug. The risk has already been taken. So I'm still not hearing what the FDA can do to assure the drug companies that they're not going to be put at additional risk, so I am able to access the medication.
Well, you have to, to some extent, I think this is an excuse. I'll be very honest with you, that people do not want to do access programs because they're focused on the development program. They'll get the drug on the market, and so they say, oh, well, the FDA will hold this against us and we won't get our drug approved, and that has never happened. Well, that's what they're saying.
Assurance, then, can you give them some assurance in writing or some type of statement that you won't be, and that will take that excuse away? And it'll be one less barrier that I'll have to get through, and me and the rest of this room.
Well, I can't say we're going to ignore anything that's learned out of an expanded access program and approve the drug anyway. That wouldn't make any sense. So. Yeah, well, I think as I said, we believe in expanded access. We're happy to set up these programs. We are not happy to not know the effects of the drug. It could be, and we've had other expanded access programs like that, where the clinical trial is very small and thousands of people are in the expanded access program. And we've learned a lot more about what the drug does and so forth, and that then is provided to everybody when the drug is approved. So I'm not sure, honestly, if we did this, which I don't think is a wise thing to do, if the companies then would suddenly start giving the drug out. I think we would remove a reason that they have that they can point at somebody else as causing the problem.
All right, we have time for one more question.
My name is Stan Williams, and I'm from Indiana, and my neurologist is brilliant from the ALS clinic at IU Medical Center in Indianapolis, and he's also very progressive. And he admitted that the medications I'm taking for my fasciculations and my severe cramps have an effect to put me in a fog all day. And I mentioned to him, asked him about a friend of mine had turned me on to research on the effects of CBD oil, and which is the non-hallucinogenic derivative from cannabis. And I know this seems a strange question from a short old bald guy, but I tried it, and it has an amazing effect to calm my muscles. But he also said the reason it's not welcome by the established research community is because it's a Schedule I substance, and the FDA cannot approve research on a Schedule I substance, thanks to a law back, I think, in the Nixon era. But and his work with the narc police, Elvis. But I'm curious: is there any hope that the FDA might allow for such research? That is, he admitted, the neurologist admitted, the anecdotal evidence is overwhelming. And I'm telling you, on my personal experience, it is amazing in its effect to calm my muscles and not put me in a fog.
Yeah, so I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, it's not true that research cannot be done. It's that there are more restrictions based on the DEA. Actually, there are trials going on in that substance in seizure disorder in children, intractable seizures. So, yeah, we encourage actually research on CBD oil and other related substances to see what their medical value is, because there are things like the dose, and we are very interested in things like quality control to make sure you're getting the same amount each time. So when you get a pharmaceutical that FDA is approved, you can know that it's going to be sterile if it needs to be, and it's going to have the same potency each time you take it, and so forth. So research is the pathway to figure these things out, and we have no particular bias against CBD oil whatsoever. So hopefully it will get studied. I think the seizure disorder studies are furthest along, but that then could really open up a path for more study.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Can we please thank Dr. Woodcock? And I want to really give Dr. Woodcock a warm applause, because there aren't many such high-profile public officials that would be willing to come up, not only give a speech, but also take the tough questions from the audience. And I think that's quite admirable, and we really appreciate you doing that. We might not always like the answers, but at least we're having the dialogue, and that's absolutely important. And what I heard was advocacy works, right? All the work that the association has done with the guidance, bringing attention, really talking not only with FDA, but with our congressmen and congresswomen really works. So what you're doing here today and tomorrow is very powerful. So thank you all. Now we're going to turn our attention. I have a public service announcement. I think we had a couple last night. Who's calling me? Somebody's calling me. I'll go back to my public service announcement. Just a reminder that there is some registry work and stuff happening with the NIH in one of the vast corners in the Independence Room. So if you are a person living with ALS, please make sure to stop by that, especially during our research expo, which is going to happen now. That expo is going to go from, and it's not just research, there are all kinds of services in there. So we hope you take some time. That's from 11:15 to 12:30, and then join us back in here in the ballroom for lunch and for a panel with congressional staffers. So thank you. Great morning. We look forward to seeing you in the afternoon.